Welcome to Shattering Myths, a program that is devoted to the most important and indeed the fastest growing segment of society. To those of you who, like me, know that the world's political, religious, military, and economic institutions are corrupt, that they are actually counterproductive, and that they cannot be fixed. Our mission is therefore to look behind the headlines, to know who is working against our interest, to understand how they are doing so, why they are doing so. Because exposing and condemning errant and treacherous schemes, no matter if they are political, patriotic, or religious, isn't hateful. It's caring. In our concluding hour, we're going to use evidence and reason to explore the Torah, which means teaching, not law, because it's unreligious and yet enriching, liberating and empowering covenant, provides the only reliable answer for you and your family. Better than preparing for the onslaught that is to come is to engage with God. Our phone number, if you'd like to participate in this discussion anytime over the next 3 hours, is 877-300-7645. Fox News is reporting that the election last year of self-professed moderate President Hassan Rouhani has not brought Iran's Christians any relief. Well, that's according to a new United Nations report, which finds that the Islamic republics, and Fox's words, Bible believers, are more prosecuted and persecuted than ever. Now, here's the rub. We've done a number of programs on the history of President Hassan Rouhani. He is not a moderate, even though that is how the media continually presents him. He was presented as the moderate alternative to Ahmadinejad, who was a fundamentalist and anarchist. But the man's history is anything but moderate. His youth was spent with the grand Ayatollah Khomeini. He was his understudy in France when he was in exile. He returned to Iran during the time the United States was backing away from its support of the Shah, specifically to prepare for not only Ayatollah Khomeini's return, but for the establishment of an Islamic state based on Sharia in Iran. You couldn't find a more fundamentalist Muslim, a Muslim with more extreme credentials as being in the camp of the mullahs than Rouhani. And during the Iraq-Iran war, back at a time when Iraq was the enemy of Iran, as opposed now to simply Iran West as a result of the American botched invasion, Rouhani was a leader in the Iranian military. After that time, when it became obvious that Iran was going to be able to complete its nuclear ambitions after its only enemy, Iraq, was given to it and therefore enabled it to focus on the long-range production of a nuclear arsenal. It was Rouhani that managed this subterfuge around the world to enable Iran to develop and to enrich uranium, to develop the technology for a bomb. He was the one that constantly confused the Western world, saying that, Iran is just interested in developing energy. No, this is a country that floats on an ocean of natural gas that has so much oil that it simply burns off the natural gas. And natural gas is a far more efficient means to boil water, which is how a electrical generation plant works. That's how a nuclear plant works. The fission heat boils water, just as natural gas does, a country that floats on natural gas, that burns it up rather than using it, would never aspire to develop nuclear energy. And, of course, it was Rouhani that was the head of the negotiating team from Iran when it became obvious that they had no interest in enriching uranium for electrical production, which is 3 to 4% fissile purity, when they spent billions of dollars on tens of thousands of centrifuges, burying them under a mountain to protect them, taking uranium 235 to 20% fissile purity, which is the preparation for a bomb and completely unusable in the generation of electricity. He is the most effective liar on behalf of Shia Islam anywhere in the world. Well, the detailed report, according to the United Nations and Fox, finds that Iran has continued to imprison Christians for their faith and has designated house churches and evangelical Christians as, quote, according to the United Nations, threats to national security. At least 49 Christians were among the 307, I should say, religious minorities being held in Iranian jails as of January 2014, noted the United Nations, which also blasted the regime for its hostility to Jews, Baha'is, Zoroastrians, and Dervish Muslims. All of this contained in the UN report. Now you might say, wait a minute, 49 Christians being religiously prosecuted, 370 religious minorities being held in Iranian jails, that's a meaningless number. Well, I'm telling you that it is an extremely meaningful number. You see, Iran is 99.9% Islamic. And in a country that is 99.9% Islamic, to have 307 religious minorities in jail, in addition to those who have been killed, is quite meaningful. This is a quote then from the Deputy Director for Policy for the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. Based on the report, he says, these are indicators that President Rouhani has no influence over hardliners, who remain fully in charge of the judiciary and security apparatus, government entities that are responsible for the most severe abuses against religious minorities. This fellow's name, this moron's name, nincompoop's name might be more appropriate. A gentleman who is paid by your tax dollars, if you're an American, is Dwight Bashir. Now, the reason I say that Dwight Bashir is a well-paid nincompoop working for the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom is because he came to the conclusion after reading the report that, oh, President Rouhani, he's a good guy. He just is thwarted. It's those hardliners that keep him from being able to do the right thing. We should still support Rouhani. Well, the problem is Rouhani. The problem is everyone in a leadership position in Iran, whether they are political or religious, because they're all both political and religious. There is no distinction in a country that is 99.9% Islamic. And politics, religion, and militantism. And it is fundamentalist Islam that is opposed to all other religions. Now, I know that there's that one line in the Quran that says there should be no distinction between religions. You know, it even goes on to indicate that, oh, perhaps there should be some tolerance, some mutual acceptance. But the line was immediately abrogated in the Quran itself, which means, according to the law of Quranic abrogation as presented in the second surah, that when Allah contradicts himself and comes up with a entirely different approach, the more recent approach is the one that prevails over the one that has been overturned And in the 9th surah, Allah says there should be absolutely no tolerance whatsoever for peaceful Muslims. They're hypocrites. You ought to kill them. In fact, you need to kill them. And then the 5th surah, which is the last revealed, Allah again transitions in his definition of infidels and saying that those that Muslims need to prosecute, that they need to kill. In fact, he actually says of Christians that Muslims ought to crucify them, that Muslims ought to cut off the hand and the legs of Muslims, or excuse me, of Christians on opposite sides, that it ought to imprison them, that it ought to torture them. It's what the Quran says. It's not that Rouhani is a good guy and is thwarted. He's part of the problem. He is a fundamentalist Muslim, and therefore, in a nation that is entirely controlled, without any influence of anything other than fundamentalist Islamic theology, anyone who is not a Muslim, in fact, of the sect of Islam that is in control, is considered unworthy of life, unworthy of possessions, unworthy of influence, worthy only of torment, submission, robbery, and death. This is another quote. It is from Senator Mark Kirk, who is a Republican from Illinois. This report is an important reminder about the true nature of the Iranian regime, said Mark Kirk. We can't pretend that we are negotiating with Western moderates. We are negotiating with Islamic radicals who persecute Christians, Baha'is, and other religious and ethnic minorities and women, while denying all of its citizens basic human rights, including the freedom of speech and assembly. Now, other than putting radicals after Islamic, his statement is correct. This is the nature of Islam. Half the population is savagely abused women, and all citizens are deprived. The UN report on Iran reads that in 2013, authorities arrested at least 42 Christians, of whom 35 were convicted for participation in informal house churches. I mean, to even meet in one's home as a Christian in Iran got you thrown in jail. Isn't that amazing? I mean, in America, and many of the listeners here live in Republic of South Africa, New Zealand, and Australia, in South America, in Canada, the idea that by gathering in your home, something that you choose to do in the privacy of your home. Now, while I'm not an advocate for being a Christian, the fact that choosing to be a Christian and to do so quietly in the privacy of your home is a criminal offense in a nation that is on the cusp of or already has developed nuclear bombs. Ought to be extraordinarily frightful. And the realization that the United States hugely elevated this nation's influence in the world and in the region ought to make you disgusted if you live in the West. You know, when the United States invaded Iraq and gave Iran's only enemy to them in a silver basket and said, "Here, take it," look what we did. It's just astonishing. These house churches are an association, are perceived as an association, as a a place of potential evangelical activity, and that anything that has any indication of Christianity is immediately attacked in this country. We had a caller a few months back, was trying to talk about how there were so many wonderful and happy Jews living in Iran. And, of course, we quickly set the caller straight. Of course, the caller didn't want to mention the Christians that are being persecuted there. There isn't a Christian church there. Just people trying to meet in their homes, and they're thrown in prison. Iran's opaque justice system imposed prison sentences on Christians ranging from 1 to 10 years. Quote, under the law, religious minorities, including recognized Jews, Christians, and Zoroastrians, face discrimination in the judicial system and, as a result, even harsher punishments, said Shahid, who is an internationally recognized expert on human rights. Hello, Glenn. How do you respond to this extraordinarily sad news?
Well, are you there?
Yes.
Okay, very good. Well, in listening to what you're saying, I'm reminded of that much revered classic movie, Mars Attacks, in which Jack Nicholson, as President of the United States, is, after the enemy has killed his wife and his cabinet, is attempting to shake hands with the leader of the Martians to say, well, thinks his persuasive abilities are so great. Why can't we all work together? And they shake hands, and the hand of the Martian leader comes off, climbs up his sleeve across his shoulder, down, and then the thing stabs him in the back.
Yeah, it's exactly what the Americans are doing with Iran right now, saying that they're, particularly the Obamas of the world, they're so grotesquely egotistical that they think that their power of influence, their power of rhetoric, their sheer intellect, the reasonableness of their nature will cause that those who they talk to acquiesce to whatever it is that they advocate. And so they look at a Rouhani, they look at Iran as someone else to bring into the fold. And
yeah, we can schmooze anyone because we're so slick.
Yeah. And how's it working out for us, Glenn?
Not too well.
No.
But I may have been the caller who spoke of the Jews in Iran.
Okay.
But I was merely parroting reports that, I had heard that come from several different sources that, the Jews were basically unpersecuted in Iran.
Ah, yes, okay. And then what we discovered together is that those sources, which you probably anticipated, were erroneous, and it is always a useful endeavor for us to dispel myths. And so you brought us a myth, and we were able to resolutely discard it. So I appreciate you doing that. Stay with us. We're going to continue to cover the malfeasance that is taking place in Iran. While the persecution detailed in the United Nations report includes wrongful imprisonment and even death sentences, it also takes more subtle forms, according to Ahmed Shahid, the UN special reporter on the situation of human rights in Iran. He said that in Iran, Christians have reported having viruses planted on their computers after visiting Christian websites so that they can be tracked. Iran's regime issued a flurry of angry responses to the United Nations report. This is their response. Quote, the enemy's ploy. Now, the enemy here is the United Nations. I mean, the United Nations is so overtly pro-Islam, it's almost laughable. I mean, the United Nations destroyed its credibility years ago when it became pro-communist, and in the fall of communism, they became pro-Islamic. And yet the the Iranian regime, this is Rouhani's government, wrote, "The enemy's ploy is a vicious circle," speaking of the United Nations, "which changes according to the political situation." Mohammad Javad Larijani, head of Iran's High Council for Human Rights, told state-controlled Tehran Times. Larijani has in the past been an advocate of stoning of women as a punishment and called for Israel's destruction while standing near the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. So in 2008, here's the guy that is the head of the High Council for Human Rights in Iran today. And in 2008, he stood next to the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin and called for the destruction of Israel, while saying that he was also an advocate for stoning women. Sounds like my kind of guy. What do you think, Glenn? Yeah, we've had a little silence here from Glenn, but
I'm here. I'm sorry. I put mute things while I'm waiting. Sorry.
Yeah, just astonishing that
pretty reprehensible stuff. Yeah, the UN. It seems to me. Well, first of all, overall, the globalists seem to be have a naive, sophomoric, almost adolescent sense of invulnerability to begin with.
Mm-hmm.
So they, and then consequently, they think they can, treat as useless idiots any group or ideology that suits their, purposes for, momentarily, and that in the end they can, they can run any tiger and not get eaten in the long run,
Yeah, and they like the Islamic tiger because the Islamic tiger is a control mechanism. The elitists with organizations like the UN want to control the world. I mean, that's their goal.
Exactly.
And when they look at the various forms of governance, republics are very hard to control, but Islamic countries are extremely easy to control because there's no free press, there's no freedom of assembly, there's no freedom of religion. They are run almost exclusively by military juntas or theological regimes, and they're all set up as fascist fiefdoms. And so, I mean, it's their idea of nirvana. Now, what they will do, of course, is use them to the point where they can then impose their will upon them and undermine the various people they claim to be supporting. But here, while the UN is overtly pro-Islamic for the reasons that you have stated, this is the head of the High Council for Human Rights of Iran calling the United Nations an enemy. And then this same guy that is head of Iran's Commission for Human Rights, he's called for Israel's destruction while standing next to the Holocaust Memorial in Berlin. And, of course, he's an advocate for stoning of women. I don't know how much news we have to get, how many statements, how much evidence we have to collect from Islam and from those in charge of of Islamic countries before people recognize that the problem is Islam.
Right. Well, how many times do you have to be fired upon before we stop believing it when they say, "Do not run, we are your friends"? And Jack Nicholson at the UN is still trying to shake hands. That's the same thing.
Yeah, it's exactly it is the same thing. It is. I don't know if it's purely ignorance, but certainly ignorance plays into it. If it's purely the fact that we're irrational, that even though we know many things, we don't seem to understand anything. We can't make reasonable conclusions, or if it's a combination of both, or it's deliberate.
Lucifer always rewards his servants with betrayal. It's that simple.
Yes.
They all think that it's, Job and Shachar, whatever title he is, it's the subtown, the adversary. When you serve evil and then you get betrayed, look at these bankers. They serve the evil ones, and now these bankers are all dead.
Right.
You think that you're in with the in crowd, and you get the night of the long knives. How many examples do you need?
Yeah, it's interesting that this prophecy that we are pursuing in our second and third hours of the program from Yahowah 17 and 18, as we transition into the 18th chapter and Yahowah condemns the United States, what you find is that in his conclusion of what is going to occur, he actually describes the treatment of the elite in hell. He goes into a vivid description, and what he basically says is what you've just said, is that those who have allied themselves with the adversary, whether it be for economic gain or political power or military influence or whatever it might have been,
ye shall be as gods.
Yeah, and right, and guess what happens to them? According to the only real God, he says the very people who fed them and supported them turn against them and they mock them. And so it is an eternal betrayal that the religious and political and the militaristic and the economic motivated are going to endure. Saba.
And it's amazing how easily humans can be persuaded to sell their birthright and their blessing for mess of pottage, isn't it?
I think, the primary path that we're going to witness into the tribulation. Yeah, the tribulation is going to be ushered in by promises of peace and then world war. But I think that the primary mechanism that's going to lure the preponderance of people to the side of evil during the tribulation is debt forgiveness as a consequence, as a benefit for promising one's allegiance to the new regime. And so they're literally going to be selling their soul for promises that they will be out of debt.
And when you think about the fact that it's something that, according to God's law, the Shemitah should have been provided anyway in the first place, if it had been godly.
Yes. Yeah. In fact, it's one of the things it's interesting that in the celebration of the Yobel, of the year of Yahowah's Lamb, every 50 years, is debt forgiveness. Debt forgiveness is part of God's plan, but it's not debt forgiveness as a scheme to control others, as will be the scheme that they will fall to during the upcoming tribulation. Returning to this story, there's a couple of more comments on it.
Got to go.
Okay. Thank you, Glenn, for calling in. Saba Farzan, who is a German-Iranian journalist and a director of political studies at the Institute for Middle Eastern Democracy. Can you imagine that you're chosen? It's hard to read this stuff with us and not laugh. That you've chosen the field of Middle Eastern democracy. I mean, there's only one democracy in the Middle East. Only one. It's Israel. And every other country in the Middle East is trying to destroy it. Anyway, he told Fox News, he has a fancy title, so Fox News ought to have thought that would have been really swell. Quote, "The situation of Christians and other religious minorities in Iran is very dire because the Iranian regime is a Sharia state." Well, he didn't say a whole heck of a lot here, other than in Sharia, which is the practice of law that mirrors Muhammad's words and deeds. Now, if you are wondering the basis of Sharia, it is based entirely on Sunnah. You've probably heard the word Sunnah before. It is the basis of the sect of Islam, the majority sect of Islam, representing 80% of Muslims worldwide, called Sunni Muslims. Sunnah is the example of Muhammad. Now, Muhammad's example is not codified in the Quran. It is codified in the Hadith, which are oral reports from Muhammad and his companions. And in the two earliest Hadith collections, though the two chronological presentations of Muhammad's life, his words and deeds, the Sirah, or biography of Muhammad, compiled by Ibn Ishaq, and the Tariq, which is the history of Islam, compiled by Tabari, that in both of those two, 99% of the information attributable to Muhammad, his words and deeds, present him as 99% now. This is not cherry-picking the worst from a sea of good material. 99% of the material presents Muhammad as repulsive, as a pedophile, as incestuous, as a rapist, as a mass murderer, as a ruthless terrorist, as a kidnapper, as a slave trader, as being sadistic, to being an overt liar. That's the nature of this man. And it is upon this man and only this man that Sharia is based. So, ought we not expect a legal system based upon the life and the words of the most repulsive man who ever lived to be disgusting, to be vile, to be something that we ought not to tolerate under any circumstance? And why would you negotiate with such people? The last comment I made in the last segment ought to resonate. It doesn't, unfortunately, resonate with any political or military leader, no diplomat in America, but it really ought to. Why would anybody in their right mind negotiate with someone who not only is governed by Sharia law, but who mandates Sharia law? Their moral code is based upon the most repulsive man who ever lived. Their moral code condones rape. It condones pedophilia. It condones slavery. It condones kidnap for ransom. It condones mass murder. It condones terrorism. And it condones lying. Why would anyone negotiate with someone whose constitution says, and this is in the 9th surah of the Quran, that any agreement between a Muslim and non-Muslim is not binding on the Muslim? And it's set into the context of the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, where Muhammad signed an agreement that said that he would not terrorize Mecca for 10 years. That he wouldn't raid it for 10 years, that he wouldn't kidnap any Meccan citizen for 10 years, that he would not rob any Meccan caravan for 10 years. And the following year, he came down and promptly conquered the place. And the 9th surah of the Quran is his wannabe God's endorsement of that kind of depravity. And the West, ignorant of this, arrogant in its own superiority, thinks that it's wise for us to have diplomatic discussions and treaties with people governed by Sharia law. The last statement in this article is from this same individual, Shabah Farzan, who is the German-Iranian journalist and director of political studies at the Institute for Middle Eastern Democracy. He says this dictatorship oppresses viciously all of these precious groups. Precious. Oh, good grief. With the abhorrent justification of Islamic law, of Sharia. And by that, it violates Iran's constitution and a long-standing tradition within Persian culture of peaceful tolerance and respect towards fellow Iranians with diverse religious backgrounds. What a moron. Yes, the regimes in the Middle East are not democracies. They are dictatorships which oppress. Their constitutions are useless, meaningless. They're less meaningful than is America's Constitution, which is universally negated and ignored. To look at a constitution for an Islamic democracy is an utter and complete waste of time. You want to know their constitution? Read the Quran. Read the Hadith. And you will know their constitution. And it is pathetic. It is disgusting. It is repulsive. Violating Iran's constitution with Sharia law, just what it demonstrates is that in Islam, the only thing that matters is Islam. That if there is a conflict between the words of men and the words of the Quran, the words of Muhammad, that Muhammad's words always prevail. And Muhammad was the most disgusting man who ever lived. He was among the most stupid men who ever lived. That's why the Quran is the worst book ever written. There is no hope of successfully negotiating with, working with, developing a reasonable solution with, achieving a peaceful outcome with people who are influenced by Islam, and especially under Sharia law. As for the Persians, they were about as peaceful as were the Romans, about as peaceful as were the Spartans. You see, man's human institutions, political and religious institutions, are very seldom tolerant or peaceful. The Persians were no exception.